or sell it, grab another one. That's what we have to do. And that's why people don't use stocks as currency. People use stocks as investments because you lock up your money and you buy time. It's not good for trading in the short term. That's not good. I'm just saying it's not. I'm not saying don't spec. Okay, if your only goal with crypto is to speculate on it, go ahead. Like there are lots of people who can speculate. I'm not saying it's not high on the schemes. I'm just saying when you apply a sociological lens to it, it's like counterproductive as a currency. We're speculating on the no, it's not. It's not. Okay. Look at the commission, it's called the bank, Silicon Valley Bank. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. It's an investment. You don't think Silicon Valley Bank has it's an investment. You know how much they got? Yeah. I'm sure they got the US. By the US. You're saying they got that? Yeah. Whenever you're like, by the federal or like the central bank, right? The central bank or investment bank protects you up to 200,000. For this is not the high bank. You can easily go off and then you can just that's a regular account on the other hand. So anything, let's say, you install
Okay, I'll do it, and then I'll... Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's Launchpad live session. Today, we're going to be talking about financials and funding 101, so a really easy introduction to these topics because they are very important in startup land. So just to start off by acknowledging the University of Calgary, which is located in the heart of the southern Alberta, which we both acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Pekainai, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nations, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. So today, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker. We have Kurt White, who you guys all know as a coach in the Launchpad program, and he's the social innovation specialist here at the Hunter Hub. Some fun facts about Kurt. He is from Toronto, more specifically Mississauga. So anyone who's here from Toronto, Kurt's your guy. He is also a self-proclaimed sports fan and has either participated in or watched every single sport. So one of my favorite activities is to go up to him and ask him about the most random sports and see if he can talk about it or not, or has any insights on it. And the third fun fact about Kurt is that he is a Leafs fan, which feels particularly relevant for tonight since the Flames are playing the Leafs. So I hope you win. It's Toronto, so we don't know. So, Kurt, welcome.
Okay, go Leafs, go. Okay, awesome. Everyone's hearing me okay? Okay, so evening, everyone. So like Les mentioned, my name is Kurt White. I'm the specialist social innovation here at the Hunter Hub. And I'm going to be talking about financials and funding. Like Alessa mentioned, the kind of game plan for tonight is to be more of an introduction to these concepts. They're obviously fundamentally important for your venture, but my goal here is to kind of walk you through really the stages that go into developing your financial projections and your pro forma that goes into launching a new venture. So I'm going to give you some strategies and some tips on how you can do that and do that effectively. And then if we have enough time here, towards the end, I'll also go through funding strategies and a quick overview, very light overview of accounting statements. And the reason we're going to save accounting statements for the end is at this stage, for a lot of you with a brand new venture, you're not going to have to worry about accounting statements just yet. So I'll just kind of do a brush over those and give you some insights on what those entail and just so you can kind of speak the language. But the bulk of tonight's session is going to really focus on building out kind of your financial projections. Okay, so when it comes to understanding your venture's financials, let's say if anyone wants to kind of just shout out, what are some reasons as to why you think this would be so valuable or so important kind of moving forward? Yeah. You don't run out of money. Exactly, don't run out of money. Yep. Budget accordingly, exactly. Those go hand in hand. One more. Exactly, you see where you're heading down the line, right? So the financials are a really key component for just being able to maintain and sustain and manage your business effectively. So some key aspects, it's going to answer the key questions that relate to your venture. So it's being able to understand how much money do you need, what level of investment do you need, when do you need that investment, where's that money going, right? Those are the key questions that are going to impact your day-to-day operations. That's what's going to make sure that you're not running out of money, that you can budget accordingly, right? That you can see where you're heading, right? Those are the key questions that are going to be answered, among others, through your financials. Another key aspect of understanding your financials is it allows you to protect your venture, so to speak, right? So is anyone familiar with when you hear the term like, that's not market or that's market? right? So generally, it just refers to, like the market price or the market rate, right? What's the going cost for this particular thing? So if you're running your business, you need to have an understanding of, if you're bringing in certain supplies, what is the appropriate rate for those supplies so that you're not getting ripped off, right? And when you reach a stage where you're talking to investors, you want to also have an understanding of the valuation of your business and what's an appropriate level of equity to give up when you're having those conversations with potential investment, right? So you want to understand what is the appropriate market rate for certain things, and that's going to help you to protect your venture in the long run. And then obviously it plays a huge role in helping you to grow, scale, and sustain your operations as you move forward. So financial modeling. So some of those key questions that are going to go into the key questions that your financial projections are aiming to answer. It's really what are going to be your startup costs and how are they going to be distributed in time, right? So what do you need for R&D? What do you need for marketing? What's going to be the initial investment? All of those things are going to be answered by developing a clear financial projection model. You're also going to want to be able to answer your time to first revenue, right? So how much time is it going to take between your initial investment when you get started to the time when you're actually selling to customers, right? How long is it going to take from that point forward until you actually break even on your investment? And then what's your valuation at exit? So how much money is your company ultimately going to be worth? Excuse me. So those are the key questions that you're going to aim to answer via your financial projections. So everything that you do as you develop them should be done with these things in mind, right? So you're building it out with the intention of being able to answer these questions. So when you have these conversations with potential investors down the road, potential partners down the road, right, you're able to answer those and answer them with a certain level of accuracy. So how do you get there? So the first thing that I want you to keep in mind when we're doing pro forma, so like these pro forma is just referring to like future projections, everything's going to be cash based, right? So, and I'll explain this in a little bit, but for those of you that are familiar with traditional accounting, they don't necessarily use a cash-based process, right? If you're using traditional accounting, like accrual accounting methods, you're going to be accounting for revenue in different times, accounting for expenses in different ways, and it doesn't necessarily reflect the actual money coming in and out of your bank account. So when you're putting together these projections, what we're going to base them on is the actual money coming in and coming out. Right? So how much cash is going in throughout the flow of kind of your business operations, how much money is coming out of the company, and you really have to change that mindset around traditional accounting when you're putting together these pro forma, right? So with traditional accounting, it's valuable, and that's why I mentioned we're going to brush over it at the end, because it is important, and when you get to a stage where you're talking to the banks and things like that, that's where you're going to have to be able to have this information and present it accordingly. But with the pro forma and your financial projections, it is going to be primarily based on the actual money coming into your venture and the actual money coming out, right? So something like, so I have here AR and depreciation, et cetera. It's not very important for you right now. And the reason being, so AR, like your accounts receivable, is, when you make a sale, but the actual money doesn't come in until, let's say, 30 days later based on kind of the agreement in that contract. In traditional accounting, you would say, well, we've made, this much money and that counts as part of our revenue. And that works for a larger company, but for a startup, it doesn't really matter if you have, $1 million in revenue that's supposed to come in 90 days if you can't afford to sustain your operation for those 90 days. Right? So that's where the difference between your projections and your traditional accounting comes in. Same thing with depreciation. I can buy a $10 million asset, and then with a traditional accounting, I can depreciate it over the course of, let's say 10 years. So I'm only paying a portion of it, technically, I'm only paying a portion of that per year, right? But again, for a large company, that is fine. For a small company, like a startup, it doesn't really matter if you're technically saying that I'm only paying this much money per year, because that's $10 million out of your bank account, and you're not going to be able to use that for the things that you need to sustain yourself. Right? So that's the difference where traditional accounting and your financial projections are going to be different. Okay, so when we're putting together our financial projections and everything I'll show you here moving forward, it's based on that concept that it's the exact money that's coming in and out of the business. Are there any questions on that so far? I'll periodically break for questions just because it's going to be a lot of content. Okay, so when you're putting together your financial projections, so remember, cash is the basis for your projections. You're going to have four main sections, and you'll see later on, each one of these sections will be expanded upon as you add in more detail and more information. But generally speaking, you have four main projections. So it's your monthly revenue, monthly expenses, the financial result, and your cash at hand. So that's how much cash and money you actually have in the bank, right? And then what you'll do as you put this together, you always want to start with your revenue, and then everything else is going to flow from there, right? Quick question.
When in the process of running a startup should you open a bank account for your startup?
That's a good question. So for those online, when should you open a bank account for your startup? I would say as soon as you're in a position where you're going to be making any kind of business-related transactions on behalf of your business, there's value there in starting in opening up a bank account. If you want to keep your financials, like your personal finances, separate from your business, that's how a lot of people will do it to kind of just keep themselves organized. Yeah. But yes, so with the financial projections, you'll start with your revenue, everything else is going to flow from there. So with the revenue, so there's two different approaches I'm going to break down here. So the first approach, and this is most common, is what we refer to as a top-down approach. So this is what you hear kind of most often, where you start with your total market. So you'll say, hey, I'm going to enter into the t-shirt business, and the t-shirt business is worth $10 billion a year. And if I can get 1% of that market, my company is going to be worth hundreds of millions, right? That's the top-down approach, and that's the most common approach. So you start with your total market, then you kind of get down into your particular share of that market, and it's really based on your anticipated market penetration, right? So like I was saying there, so your total market is X per year. We think we're going to get this percent, so that means we're going to make this much money. It's a very popular approach. I'm sure everyone in this room has probably heard a pitch or multiple pitches where the entrepreneur uses this approach, but it's a very hard to validate approach. Okay, so there's some challenges with it, which I'll go over here. So this is an example of a top-down approach kind of spreadsheet where they're just looking at the revenue piece. So like I mentioned, depending on the approaches that you use, those four main sections will expand quite a bit. So this is an example of the top-down approach and how they're using it to calculate their revenue. So you see at the top there, they're saying industry size about $1 million, right? The market size per month, they're breaking it down just at $1 million divided by 12, right? Then they're saying their expected market share is, just a percentage that they're anticipating, and then based on that percentage is how much revenue they expect per month, right? So it's very straightforward, it's a very popular approach, and it's very, very common. So, question?
Can you go back to the previous one?
Yeah.
Okay, so here, like it mentions market size per month. Where does that come from? How it gets calculated?
Divided by 12.
Yeah, so exactly. So what he's done is they've said the industry size forecast is $1 million, they've just divided that by 12. So it's a very straightforward calculation, but as you'll see, it's not necessarily the most accurate, right? So it's a very appealing approach. A lot of people use this approach, like we mentioned. Yes, it can be considered an analytical approach, right? And there's a lot of great websites out there that will give you market size and market forecast and all of that information, and you can cross-check it and cross-reference it across multiple different sources. So, you can argue that the numbers are going to be accurate, right? And then you can make it more sophisticated as well. You can break it down into your number of customers, your number of transactions, how much you expect per transaction, right? But there's a few issues with this approach. So does anybody have any thoughts? What are some issues with the top-down approach? Yeah.
If you have a huge market, you can say like a low percentage number, like you can say 1% penetration. But if you're talking about, I don't know, like the global oil industry, that's billions of dollars. So like you can make a small penetration seem feasible just because it's a low percentage value. But in reality, it's very unrealistic to hit.
Yep, that's a good point. So for those online, essentially, if you are arguing that you're going to get a small percentage of a large pie, so to speak, you can make it seem like a feasible opportunity because you're only saying I'm going to make 0.05%. But if that is a massive pie like the oil industry, you're talking billions of dollars, and that's not necessarily a realistic aspect. What's one other issue that we can see with the top-down approach? Any other thoughts? Yeah, I'll go over here.
I think it's too basically linear in the sense that it doesn't account for like ups and downs. Let's say competing with seasonal highs and lows.
Yeah, that's a good point. So for those online, it doesn't account for seasonality, right? So that's another aspect. The one thing I would say about the seasonality, like this example, yes, it was very straightforward, but there are forecasted projections that you can get that do account for seasonality. But that is a good point, right? Using this traditional top-down, sometimes you miss things like that and how they might impact your business. Some other issues with this approach, it's not really supported by evidence. So even though you're getting a lot of information on the market forecast, you don't really have any evidence that your company is actually going to be able to get that market penetration. You have no information or data that's saying that you're going to get that 0.5%. Why would your market share be 0.5% one month, then 6% the next month, right? There's no real evidence behind that, right? And if you can't validate the estimates that you're making, then your financial projections have no value, right? You will be ripped apart when you start actually getting into a scenario where you're talking to investors or talking to banks and things like that, when you're dealing with numbers that you can't validate, right? So the top-down approach, it's a popular approach, but there's some holes in it, and the main hole is that it can't be validated in terms of how it relates to your business specifically, and because of that, it becomes essentially useless when you're putting together your projections. So the second approach and the alternative, and this is the one I'm going to kind of do a deep dive in, and this is the one that I always recommend, is called the bottom-up approach. So the bottom-up approach, it's much more realistic because it can be validated, but it's very time-consuming. So, it doesn't take. You can do a lot of research, but if you're doing the top-down approach, you can do a lot of research, but it's not going to take you that long to kind of put those numbers together. Bottom-up approach takes a little bit more work, but you get more accuracy, and that's where the value lies, right? You don't want your financial projections to be way off, right? They're never going to be 100% correct, right? I had a professor that would always say that every financial projection is wrong because it's never going to be 100% right, but you can get very close. And as long as you can provide some validation and some accuracy behind where your numbers are coming from, that's going to be key in helping you to at least stay on track. So with the bottom-up approach, you start with efforts, so your money and time that you're investing toward acquiring customers, right? And then you're using that to determine your revenues and then your expenses. So for example, if I invest $3,000 into Google Ads, and I see that from my initial investment, I get 500 visitors to my website, then I can calculate how much it cost me per view, right? And then out of those 500, let's say 250 of them actually bought something. Now I know my customer acquisition cost is going to be, that 3,000 divided by that 250, so it's going to be $12, right? So now I have a very realistic expense line that I can actually go back and validate, right? This is how much I spent, this is how much it cost us, this is what we got from it, right? So it's really, the bottom-up approach is going to be based on your markets, on your ventures go-to-market strategy, so your sale channels, your approach to actually getting customers and getting people to purchase your product. And the most important piece, and the reason that this is so valuable, is the fact that you are validating these numbers, right? So as you put together your own financial projections, this is the type of information that you're going to want, right? How much am I going to be spending on this particular, customer acquisition? How much is that going to lead to in revenue? And then kind of so on, right? So it's being able to point back and say, I spent this much on, customer acquisition. It results in this, so I can reasonably assume if I spend this much more, it's going to result in this, right? That's kind of where you take this.
Kurt, quick question from online.
Yeah.
This is going back a little bit, but do you have any tips on how to generate these values? Will this come with time?
Yes, so that's what we're kind of go through here. But generally, when you're going to develop these values, it usually comes from some type of test or pilot project. So, like, for example, if I was going to go back here, so you can argue, like this initial investment here of the 3,000, right? That could be considered like a test. So let's say I'm going to run a pilot project. 3,000 seems like a lot for a test, but let's say you bring it down even further, like $100. I'm going to run a quick test, invest $100 into Google Ads. What are going to be the results? Let's say that $100 leads to me getting one sale, right? That's my test, and then now I know when I put together my projections, for every $100 I spend on ads, I can expect to get one customer. So then moving forward in my projection, I can say, okay, well, I'm going to spend $3,000 on customer acquisition, so I can expect X number of customers from that. So that's kind of where the numbers will come from. Okay, so I'm going to use an example, and we'll kind of build it out together. So here's some initial information on this particular company. So they're a t-shirt company, okay? Cash on hand, so this is their own personal savings that they're investing into this company. They have $5,000, okay? They're planning on spending $2,000 on customer acquisition. They're going to sell their t-shirts at $22 a shirt. It costs them $9 to make the shirt. Their sales channel, they're going to sell through an online platform, and their marketing is all going to be done through social media. Okay, so that's kind of the basis of where we're at. Okay, they've already launched a pilot project where they've tested the investment strategy, and to do that they invested $1,000 into ads. They got 400 visitors to their Shopify site. So they know that it's going to cost them $2.50 to get a view. And then they know, based on this pilot project, that of those 400 visitors, 100 of them made a purchase. So now they know their validated customer acquisition cost is going to be $10 per sale, right, per customer. Okay? So they got those numbers from doing this pilot test. And then this is kind of where we're at right now. So together as a group, we're going to build out the kind of first month's financial projection. Okay, so like I mentioned, there's 4 main pieces to it. This is just really going to be focusing mostly on revenue and your expenses, and then your cash at hand. And then within those 4 pieces, it can get more complicated and expanded upon, as you see here. So we'll start at the top. So we know right off the bat that they've already agreed that they're going to invest $2,000 into acquiring their customers, so we can put that here. Okay. Does anybody remember what was their validated cost of customer acquisition? Yep, it was $10. Okay, so now T-shirts sold. So we know that we already know that if we invest $1,000 into our customer acquisition, that we're going to sell 100 shirts. So if we invest $2,000, what are we expecting? Pardon? 200, exactly. Right? So that's so again, that's where your numbers are all going to build from your validated experiment. Okay? Does anybody remember the selling price? How much we're selling each shirt for? 22. Okay, so what's your revenue now? So we already know we have our T-shirts sold and we have our selling price. So what's our revenue? Right on. Some quick maths. All right, so next up we have production costs. So production cost is going to be, how much does it cost us to make each shirt? So this was on the $9, that's right. Okay, so now our cost of goods sold, it's going to be our production cost and how many shirts we sold. So 1,800. Okay, and now then it gets kind of easy from here. Our gross profit, income minus our cost of goods sold. So that's our revenue minus those COGS. Yep, 26. Marketing expenditure. So this one, it's kind of tricky, but we're just going to jump back up here. So this is how much we spent. So that's our marketing expenditure. So that's that 2,000. And then from there, we know our operating profit for the month is $600, right? And then because I had $5,000 at the start, that was my savings that I had going into the month. I end the month with $5,600, right? So that's it's very simple approach, but this is how you will build out your financial projections, right? And then what you'll do here, this is just 1 month, and then you just carry it forward month 2, month 3 onward, and that's how you build out your year. And then after that, you know how much your company, or you can at least anticipate reasonably how much your company is going to be worth in a year. Just one sec. You can reasonably give an estimate of how much different investment will impact your company, right? So if I can have this mapped out for 1 or 2 years, and then I can know if I get an outside investment of X number of dollars, this is how I'm going to spend it. This is how I can expect to see a result, right? If I get a $10,000 investment, and I say I'm going to take that $10,000 and put it just into customer acquisition, you can then have a reasonable idea as to how that's going to impact your bottom line, right? So that's where these projections kind of have a lot of value, and why it's so important to do that bottom-up approach so that you can validate it and be able to refer back to it. Question?
You answered it, sorry.
Okay, perfect. So like I said, this is just, let's say, the first month for that T-shirt company. I didn't want to bore you with doing the whole thing, but then this would be, let's say, another 10 months, right? So I think we'll usually send out these slides so you can take a look through it as well. But that kind of gives you a sense of what your financial projections will look like when you've mapped them out for 1 month, 2 months, a year, beyond. So with the bottom-up approach, like I mentioned, so you start with those efforts and your go-to-market strategy, right? How are you going to be trying to acquire these customers? You translate those efforts into your projections, and then once those revenues have been determined, kind of everything else will flow from there. All right, so some common questions that we get when you're using this approach. I don't know my customer acquisition cost, or I don't know my revenue per customer. So like everything when it comes to your financial projections, you're starting off with your best guess, right? And then you can measure that during the validation process. So earlier in the Launchpad program, we talked a lot about customer discovery. We talked a lot about the business model canvas and how the business model canvas is really built with you to fill in a ton of your assumptions, right? At the very beginning, you have assumptions as it relates to each one of those topics. and then you have to validate those assumptions. So same thing goes here with your financial projections. You're going to have initial assumptions, right? Everyone is going to say, well, I have a $1 billion idea, but now how's that actually going to play out over the next, 3, 4, 5 years? So you start with your best guess, measure that during your validation process. How much are people willing to pay? How much does it cost for you to acquire each customer? Those are things that you'll be able to validate when you do like those little testing, pilot projects. You can do during your customer discovery conversations, things like that. Question?
Do investors prefer month by month, not like week by week or year by year?
That's a good question. So for those online, do investors prefer month by month versus week by week or year by year? It really depends on the investor, but generally they're going to want to see for the first few years of your venture, like of your projections, broken down by month. And then from there, once you get, let's say 4-year, 5-year onward, you can probably switch to a yearly projection. Do I ever use total market size figures? So this goes back to that idea of the top-down approach, right, where the whole total market size was kind of the basis for everything. So the answer is yes, but those are typically your long-term numbers. So as you're putting together these initial projections, you're not really caring about the actual market size, but like Danny just mentioned with his question, so we go from month to month, then we go year to year. Then you can start at that stage looking at what are your long-term aspirational goals for the company and that you intend to hit. That's where these kind of large-scale market size dollar values can start to come into play. This is where you can say, you can track the growth of the company based on these projections, and then we can say we anticipate hitting this % of the market by this time. Right? So that's where the market size figures come in, but those are down the road, kind of those aspirational figures. So, a couple notes on financial projections. You want to project revenues for about 3 to 5 years. Reason being, like I mentioned, every financial projection it's an estimate, right? It's your best guess, so it's not going to be 100% accurate. Once you get past 5 years with those projections, there's so many variables that the projection just becomes less and less valuable at that stage, right? It's not reasonable for us to say, in 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, this is what we expect on a month-to-month basis. So you just want to do your 3 to 5 years. That's a reasonable amount of time to give you a fairly accurate and reasonable approach and estimate for the financial viability of your company. Projections of profit and loss, like we mentioned already, so you're going to start kind of doing it monthly at first, and then you can, for those later years, you can just project it yearly. And then those goalposts, so those key things you want to keep in mind, right? It goes back to those key questions that you want your financial projections to be able to answer, right? What are your startup costs, right? What's needed for initial investment? How long is it going to take until you get your first revenue? How long is it going to take until you hit profit, right? You can also have in your projections first round and anticipated second round of financing and how that money is going to be spent, right? So where is it going? What level of investment are you seeking? And then how is that going to impact the growth and trajectory of your company? And then, as we mentioned, you also want to have a potential valuation at exit as well. So again, if you're looking at it in a 5-year time frame, you put together these projections, you see where you're at after 5 years, that gives you a reasonable estimate for what your company would be valued at that stage. Question?
Under your goalposts, do you want to list non-venture capital funding that you might try to acquire, like grants, business grants, and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So for those online, under goalposts, would you include non-VC funding? I would say yes when you're putting together your projections, because that initial investment, when I say investment, we always jump to VC, but it can be just money coming into the business in other different ways, so grants, things like that. that will all factor into your financial projections, right? Because that's money coming into the business, and that's going to impact how, based on how you spend it, it's going to impact the value of that company, and it's going to also impact your business operations. So that was a long answer, but yes. One more question.
How often should you be doing these projections of revenue?
Yeah, so your projections, you want to build them out monthly.
But like, so after it's like 3 to 5 years, like, would you do another one right after?
Yeah, so like a lot of things, it's going to be a living document for you, right? So you'll start with that initial projection, but then after month 1, your numbers are going to be different than what you projected. So then really after that first month, you're going to revise it and then kind of so on. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears here. So that is the financial projections piece. So actually putting together your pro forma. That was the main thing I wanted to work through in the presentation. And then now I have a few other things we're going to touch on. But before I move on, are there any other questions as it relates to actually building out your financial projections? No? Okay, perfect. So we'll continue on here. So next up, when it comes to the finances for your company, you're going to come into, two kind of interchangeable topic or names here, which is burn rate or runway. So what it refers to is how much money do you actually have on hand, and then how long are you able to operate essentially at a certain pace. So it's the amount of time that a company has before it runs out of money. Once you run out of money, that's game over for the most part, right? And it's the rate at which your company is spending money. So your burn rate is the rate at which you're spending money, and then your runway is how much time you have until you run out of money, right? And then a lot of this money is typically what's being spent on your overhead costs. Excuse me. So it's typically quoted as cash spend per month, okay, and it's determined by the money in the bank divided by your monthly spend, right? So for example, if I have a company that has $1 million in the bank, I'm spending about $100,000 a month. That's my burn rate. That means that I have 10 months until I go under. So that means as I'm putting together my kind of plan, my operating plan, as I'm putting together my projections, I'm keeping that in mind because I need to be able to know, how and when I'm going to be able to hit a stage where I'm starting to extend that runway. Okay, so it's very important that you keep these two concepts in mind because that's really going to define a lot of the decisions that you make. All right, if you're not hitting certain targets, right, it's going to impact your runway. You want to be aware of that so that you can make necessary adjustments on the fly as you go. Right, like we just mentioned, it's always going to be a living document as you kind of evolve and you start to get actual results. Okay, so I'm going to jump into funding strategies. So there's kind of 3 main funding strategies that I'm going to touch on. So one is debt, second is equity, third is grants. Sorry? Okay. So before we get into those 3 types, we're just going to quickly go through the different stages of venture development and where kind of the funding will fit. So first off, you have kind of your seed stage, right? That's really at the very beginning of the venture. So typically, it's defined less than $250K. A lot of the money at the seed stage is going to come from personal savings. It's going to come from friends, family. I always have here friends, family, and fools. That's kind of the people that you can convince to give you money right off the bat. And then grants and the non-diluted funds are typically what you're going to get in that seed stage. Second stage, where you're kind of in that development or kind of the initial launch. Oh, question.
What do you mean by non-diluted funds?
Yeah, good question. So for those online, it's what do we refer to as non-diluted funds? So non-diluted funds are funds that come in that don't take equity out of your company. So you don't have to give up ownership for that money. So typically with some investors, when they actually give you money, they want a percentage of your company in some capacity. Non-dilutive just means that you get the money, but you don't have to give up equity. So More so, things like grants would be like non-dilutive funding. If someone gives you like a loan, things like that. Yeah, so you're just not giving up equity in your company. Next up, so you have kind of that development and initial launching stage. That's where you have kind of you might see your first round, which would be like your Series A round. So I won't go too much into the whole VC side of things, but you'll typically hear of like different financing rounds or funding rounds. That just means when your like different times that your company is raising money, and then they're typically identified as kind of Series A, B, and so on. And that just is when you're getting, like, is it the first round is Series A, the second round Series B, kind of so on. So that's kind of what that refers to. So Series A is kind of that first outside investment that you're going to be looking at. And then that's typically where you see different pilot production. That's where you'll see kind of your VCs might get involved. That's where you see angels are getting involved. That's kind of that initial major funding round. Then you get to the expansion and growth stage. That's Series B and C. So again, round 2, round 3 of raising money. And at that stage, you're typically dealing with millions. And then the maturity stage and exit stage, that's where you're, again, dealing with multi-millions. You're dealing with venture capital firms, private equity investment, major corporations. At that stage, you might be looking at either being acquired or going public, is what would happen at that stage. So those are kind of the 4 stages and kind of some relevant funding types in those 4 stages. So back to those 3 kind of main funding types and kind of how they fit in. So number 1, when it comes to debt. So I'm sure we're all familiar. This is someone lends you money, you pay it back in installments, typically with interest, as well as paying back that principal amount. Equity, so this is money that an investor pays you for a percentage of ownership in your business, and it entitles that investor to a percentage of potentially future proceeds, and then potentially also handing over some decision-making power within the business as well. And then there's the grant opportunity as well. So grants, that's a sum of money given to help further your business, and it's usually done by governments, corporations, different foundations, and it does not have to be paid back, and you don't have to give up any kind of equity. So a grant is kind of that example of non-dilutive. Okay, so debt versus equity, and then I have a separate section where we'll discuss grants. So with debt, you want to make sure that you have an idea, and this is, again, where your financial projections will fit in, of how much money are you actually needing for, you don't want to take out too much debt if you don't need it, right? So how much money do you actually need to ask for from lenders, right? Some typical approaches is that you want to pay for inventory. So if it's like a physical product, a lot of people will take out a bank loan to help pay for inventory, and they'll usually buy up to a year of inventory. You might pay for another asset that you need that's going to help you to start producing revenue. It might help you to pay for some of your initial startup costs, right? But you want to make sure, and this is, again, going back to those financial projections, you want to make sure that you're able to service your interest payments in addition to your principal. So you want to make sure that you can pay back that debt with interest, right? So make sure that you're not taking out more than you need. So make sure you have a sense of what you need, right? And then work that into your projections and incorporate that cost of paying it back into your projections as an expense. So if you know in year 2, in February, I'm going to need to take out a loan for this much money because I need to do these things, right? That you can work into your projections, and then then moving forward in those same projections, you can write in how much am I going to have to be paying back, okay? Equity. So what if I want to raise equity? So after you've developed your model, right, you'll have an idea of the kinds of revenue that is possible. You have an idea of your margins. You have an idea of your operating metrics, right? So that's when you're then able to have a conversation about how much is this company valued at, right? How much is this company actually worth? So Oftentimes, startups are going to be valued based on, accordance with their peers, so other kind of startups in the same industry and other companies operating in the same region. And then the kind of multiple within your equity kind of depends a lot on, the industry standard and kind of the regional standards. That's where we go back when I mentioned the idea of like what's market, right? So what is a typical approach, or what's a typical deal within this industry, right? In some industries, it's not unheard of for a VC to take 20% for a certain amount of money. In other industries, that would be completely unheard of, right? So it's important that you have an understanding of what that looks like for your company and in the industry that you're operating. So when you start talking about equity, and equity is always going to be the most expensive thing that you give up in your company, right? Remember that. So when you start talking about equity, you want to make sure you have the numbers and the understanding behind it so that you're able to make the right decisions for your company, right? Going back to that first point about protecting your venture. And then grants. So typically grants can be used for a lot of different things, but most common is used for research and development, market expansion, and then hiring. So there's lots of grants out there. I can't give you an exhaustive list because there's so many and so many different different areas of focus. They all have different requirements and things like that. So really, it's all about taking the steps to find those grants. And there's lots of websites and organizations out there that are grant-finding organizations and that collect a lot of the grants into one kind of central location that you can then have access to when you're kind of trying to find what would fit for your business. So some of those resources, there's Get Granted, there's Pocketed, those are our websites. There's Alberta Business Grants, which is another website that run through the government of Alberta. There's a similar one, I don't think it's on here, that's run by the federal government. You can also look at industry and sector-specific organizations. A lot of them will have their own grant opportunities, right? So specifically for certain fields. The one I could think of off the top of my head, there's grants specifically for kind of working in the film industry, so things like that. So always be aware of kind of industry-specific organizations that are offering grants. There you can also look at a couple of the government grants here, so MentorWorks and IRAP. I believe we had a presentation, or we will have a presentation on IRAP within the Launchpad program. So those are just a couple of examples. But when I say that there is a massive amount of grants out there, I really do mean it. So it's just a matter of kind of searching and finding what is best for your company. And there's certain grants that are based on the founder. So, age, demographic, things like that. There are certain grants that are based on the state or the status of your business. There's certain grants out there that are based on the industry that you're working in, like I mentioned. So, that's just a couple of examples on the screen here, but make sure that you're kind of searching and using that as a funding tool, because grants are going to be kind of your best bet. It's our number one recommendation when you're looking for funding at an early stage. Grants are your best bet. Okay, there's lots of them out there. Yes, it takes some work to apply for them and to find them, but it's non-dilutive funding, which is what you need when you're starting out. Okay, there's another strategy I'm sure everyone's familiar with. That is bootstrapping. So bootstrapping is when you build a business from scratch without any outside investment or external capital. Some ways that you fund yourself, so like I mentioned, grants, personal savings, pitch competitions like the one in Launchpad, where you get cash prizes. Those are just some examples. And it's really about saving money wherever possible. So when you're bootstrapping, right, you want to make sure that you're developing low-cost prototypes, using cheap office spaces, using whatever existing resources that you have access to. Those are key in keeping your costs as low as possible to then ensure that you can effectively use every dollar that you have access to. So when it comes to bootstrapping, a couple pros and cons. Pros, obviously, you get a lot of independence and control, right? It's all your money. You're the one who's funding everything, so you don't have to answer to anybody else. Whereas with if it's dealing with business partners, or if you're dealing with outside investors, they're going to want to say in how that money is used and how that business is run. So doing it yourself, there's a pro there. You get a lot of control. Second, bootstrapping, it's attractive to investors to a certain extent. The reason I put that there is if you are a company that has a very messy cap table, is everyone familiar with the idea of a cap table? So it's how many people have ownership of your company, right? The percentage of ownership. If you're a company that has a very messy one where there's, 10 different people, some people have 10%, some people have 1%. There's some people who you'll never hear from. They're not involved in the business at all, but they were there when you were founding it, so they got a percentage of ownership, right? An investor's going to look at that and they're going to be kind of turned off from investing in that company because that investor steps in, now they're just one other person on the cap table, and that's less equity for them, right? Now we have to compete with all these other people who are also owners of this company, so we're competing for, less of a percentage, and some of those people might not even be involved in actually the day-to-day running of this business. Right? So if I'm an investor, I don't want to step into a kind of a messy situation. So if you have a bootstrapped business where it's just you, maybe one other person, that might be more attractive. Okay, some cons with bootstrapping. Your growth is going to be difficult. It's going to be much slower than if you're getting tons of outside investment. There's obvious financial risks attached to that because you're putting your own money on the line here. And it can be very, very stressful. So I've encountered companies that are bootstrapping, and essentially every single day becomes, how can I find more money to keep my runway and keep me going, right? As opposed to doing all the other aspects that go into growing and kind of scaling your business. So it can be a very stressful experience. So there's pros and cons to it. But it's obviously going to be the first point for a lot of people when they decide to start a company. Okay, and then we have a few minutes left. So like I said, I'm going to brush over some accounting statements. The idea here with the accounting statements, like I mentioned, I just want to give you a sense as to what they entail. Right now, for a lot of you at the early stages, you won't necessarily need to be putting these together. But you may encounter down the road when you're having conversations with the banks, they might want this type of information. And some investors, some do, some don't, might want to see this information as well. So I'm just going to kind of give you the high-level overview of what they entail. Before I do that, any questions on anything we've covered so far? No? Okay, perfect. So there's a lot of text on the next few screens. I did that because you'll get a copy of these slides if you're in the Launchpad program, so you can kind of refer back to it. But generally speaking, your accounting statements are just going to be a written record that conveys your business activities and your financial performance. And they are necessary and they're legally required. And there's certain formats based on where you live. So the most common format is what you refer to as the either GAAP, so generally accepted accounting principles, or IFRS, which is the International Financial Reporting Standards. Like I said, it's a lot of detail, but generally it's just a formal statement on the business activities and financial performance of your company, and then it has to be formatted a very specific way, right? And if it's not done a very specific way, then you can get in trouble. So that's kind of the idea with what this slide's all about. So the key financial statements, you have your balance sheet, which refers to your assets, your liabilities, and equity, your income statement, which is revenue and expenses, and then your cash flow statement, which is cash in and cash out of the company. Balance sheet, this reports your company's assets, liabilities, and shareholder equity at a specific point in time. So it's essentially a snapshot of what your company owns and what your company owes, as well as how much money is being invested by your shareholders. It uses shareholders here because generally this is done for like publicly traded companies. So assets are like resources that you own, so it could be like Intellectual property or physical property. Liabilities is something that you owe, so it might be loans, mortgages, accounts payable. And then shareholders' equity is how much the owners of the company have invested so far. So the general accounting equation for your balance sheet, your assets is equal to your liabilities and shareholders' equity. What that means is when you put this sheet together and you kind of crunch all the numbers, everything on your assets side should be equal to the combination of your liabilities and your equity. This is an example of what the balance sheet looks like. So you see kind of on the left-hand side, you have your assets, everything that goes into that, and then you have your total assets. And then you have your liabilities on the other side, total liabilities, and then stockholders' equity, and then total stockholders' equity, and you'll see that it adds up to the same amount. There's a very specific way for you to calculate all of these things, and that's generally, there's a whole profession built around it. But I just want to give you a sense of to what that entails and kind of the information that you want to be keeping track of. Income statement, this is kind of like your profit and loss. So it records a company's profit or loss over a period of time. And the purpose is to report a summary of the company's revenues, expenses, gains, losses, and resulting net. Your income statement is what's going to resemble kind of closest to your financial projections. And this is an example of the income statement. So you have your sales, gross margin, expenses, income, and kind of so on, and then it all boils down to your net income. This is probably what you're most familiar with, and this is what is going to resemble your financial projections. Quick question.
Why are there 2 zeros between those commas instead of 3 zeros?
Let's see, which part?
All of the parts.
Any of the parts of commas.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I don't think there's a specific reason behind it. I just kind of grabbed a snapshot to give you an example. Yeah, for sure. And then the last one is cash flow statement. So your cash flow statement, this summarizes the amount of cash and cash equivalents that are entering and leaving your company. So it measures how well the company manages its cash and how well the company generates cash to pay its obligations. So with the cash flow statement, there's kind of 2 methods that they use, indirect and direct. So what that refers to is how they end up calculating your cash flow. But indirect, you begin with net income, and then you add back in kind of your non-cash items. Direct method, you track all your transactions, and then you just focus, you kind of pull out what is exactly cash and not cash. Again, it's, most of yourselves as entrepreneurs will probably just hire on an accountant to do these types of things. But again, I want to give you a sense as to what to expect. Within your cash flow statements, you have your cash flow from operating activities. So this is how much money that a company brings in from your kind of regular business activities. You have your cash flow from investing activities. So how much money or cash has been generated or spent on investing-related activities. So that's like purchasing assets or investing in other securities. And then cash flow from financing activities. So this is your net flows of cash that are used to fund the company. So this would include paying back debt, dealing with equity, or paying out dividends. And this is an example of the cash flow statement. So like I mentioned, I skimmed through that, but yeah, more so when you get the slides, you can kind of take a look and get a little bit more detail. But generally speaking, it's just more so that you have a sense as to what those entail and what type of information that you need to be tracking. But yeah, when it comes time for you to actually do that, you'll most likely be in a position where you can maybe hire on a part-time like accounting student or someone like that to help you out with that. And then just to wrap up, so in summary, like we know, understanding your finances is vital for company health. Banks, investors, grant applications, all of that's going to want this information. It has strategic implications, so scaling. It's also important for any type of growth and R&D, so going into new markets or developing new products. And then most important here is that financial mismanagement will kill your venture, right? So if you're not managing your finances appropriately, that's going to be a nail in the coffin for your company. So it's one of the most important things to kind of keep in mind and always have your finger on the pulse. And then with that, I just want to do a quick special thanks to these three gentlemen whose work went into kind of developing this presentation, was adapted for this presentation. And they all, at one point, were involved with Haskayne. So they're all involved with the University of Calgary, so thanks to them. And then I have a couple minutes left if anyone has any specific questions. All right, perfect. I prefer more of like the Q&A throughout the presentation, so so that works. And then last slide here, we are collecting feedback for all our sessions for the Launchpad program, so you'd be able to submit that via the QR code there. Otherwise, thank you all so much.